I'm one of those people who wanted to be an architect since they were, like 5 or 6 years old. So kind of strange. But the reason why is that my godfather was an architect. He had worked for Marcel Breuer and
Oh,
had his own small practice in New York City. And so when we would once or twice a year, our family would go visit them and we'd stay at their modernist house in the forest of Connecticut. And so there was something about that
yeah.
was like, oh, this is interesting. And then a couple of classmates of mine, one in particular, her father in elementary school, her father was an architect. And so when I was literally in first grade, I wrote a poem about wanting to be an architect uh, called "I Am an Architect." So I was very, and it was published in the mimeographed elementary school paper that was called, the title of which was called Ink Spots. That was the paper, and and then this classmate of mine's father literally sent me a letter on his company letterhead. He was a partner in an architecture firm, offering me a job offer. Um, and so when in 1985, and so
Wow.
this was 1969 when I did it, and then he sent me a letter, and then he invited me to come to their office and see models there and whatnot, and then I ended up interning when I was in college for his firm, so for 3 summers. So very strange, but true.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
So
That's
never
amazing.
neglect
I,
a poem assignment. You never know where that
yeah.
can lead you.
exactly,
My first thought is
exactly.
architect is a difficult word to spell for a first grader.
It's very funny because I literally have the printout of this page,
Really?
and mine is like 5 or 6 lines. Like, I am an architect. I want to build a building. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of men. Of course, it's gendered,
Yeah,
for
yeah,
men,
yeah.
construction workers, whatever. And then like the poems on either side of me are like, an elephant wore underpants, and it's something, it's all like, I don't know where this came from, but anyway, very funny.
That's great. We might have to,
Yeah.
if you have an image, that'd be actually great to post
Yeah.
with the
Yeah,
episode.
yeah, yeah. I could show it to you
That
for
would be
sure. Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah,
I think that's a great backstory because it's for some guests. We have a lot of architects on the show. Obviously,
yeah.
their answer is a bit more, kind of elusive or amorphous.
Yes, yeah.
And so I think yours is so architecture specific. You have enough architecture background to cover like multiple guests at this point
Yeah,
with the
good.
specificity.
Yeah.
Um,
I built a lot of, I mean, I played with the classic kind of play school blocks, the kind of
mm,
natural pine blocks and I would be down in the basement of our suburban house. I grew up outside of Albany, New York, and I would be down there just for hours making, structures out of blocks. And so that's what I kind of did my thing down there. So,
I'm guessing you visited New York City, like Manhattan.
yes, my grandparents lived in Brooklyn. And so we would come
Wow.
two or three times a year. We'd come and we'd always go to like the Metropolitan Museum, or I remember going to the Guggenheim. Of course, that was pretty, impactful.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, definitely, yeah,
Yeah,
came to
so
the city a lot.
a lot of buildings that you were surrounded by when you were a kid. I was wondering, that you mentioned the modernist house kind of in a forest, which is sort of
Yeah,
I think for a lot of architects, kind of a dream, a dream project, but also a dream house to live in. That would be nice.
yeah.
Um, like, do you recall if that had more of an influence on you than, let's say, an urban setting like Manhattan, or were they? I don't know. Because they're very different environments, and some people are inspired by dense
Yeah.
urban environments. At the same time, some people less so because they're kind of stifling in tall, big boxes compared to what I imagine a
Yeah.
modernist house in a forest is.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know that I gravitated toward one or the other. The other thing that was interesting, though, about growing up in the late 60s, early 70s in Albany was they were building the mall in Albany, which is this enormous Harrison and Abramowitz, kind of almost looks like Brasilia. I don't know if you've ever seen
Hmm.
images of it, but it's the Empire State Plaza. It was the brainchild of Nelson Rockefeller, who was governor at
Wow.
the time. And so it has a series of, it has an enormous podium. It's like 100 acres of the city were demolished to build this.
Wow.
And then it has these towers, and it has a sculptural building called the Egg, which is actually the Performing Arts Center. The State Museum is there. So that was being built while I was growing up. And so that was an exposure to large scale construction. I remember seeing, because it was just under construction for like, 5 or 6 years. The other thing was, my memory of my godfather's house was, it was I guess you'd call it like a binuclear house. Like it had a living, dining space in the middle, and then there were bedrooms on either side. So like guests would be on one side and family on the other. And it was very modest, but it was kind of a floating box, which then had a concrete block kind of podium that was a sort of unfinished like mechanical space and storage. But so I definitely remember that form, and typology, but I didn't have, again, no particular preference for, the city or the country or a residential versus a, urban building. Yeah.
So you knew from the age of 2 or whatever it was,
that
you were 5, 6, okay, that you're going to be an architect, and you go and you study architecture. I mean, I'm guessing when you did the internship, you liked the internship and you still continued to pursue it. You didn't have anything after. You didn't deviate from the path.
No, and again, part of the reason I went to the University of Virginia undergraduate, I got into the architecture school from high school, but part of my attraction to the school was, should I decide that architecture wasn't the right fit, I could transfer to the College of Arts and Sciences, and I could just pursue a different major. So it was a little bit of a sort of safety valve or alternative that was out there, but once I started, I just stayed with it.
Did you have an alternative in mind? I mean, at that time, was there something that was tangential or kind of parallel?
Not really, no. I didn't have a backup plan. I was all in. Yeah.
And then I'm also always curious, so after you finish you get your undergraduate degree, did you practice for a bit of time before pursuing an MArch, or did you go directly into the MArch from, I think it was Princeton?
Yep. I went directly into the MArch. At the time in the mid 80s, there was kind of a pathway where, 4 or 5 students a year would go from University of Virginia to Princeton. And I went directly, but what I was able to do is I had a SOM traveling fellowship that I received after my first year of graduate school. So I actually took a year to do that traveling, which was really important. I mean, I think if I hadn't done that, I would really have regretted going directly from undergrad to grad school. So one of the things I counsel a lot of people on, students who I talk to, is, if they haven't worked in an office before, or even if they have, to take a little bit of time off between undergrad and grad, because then you come back and you're really focused on what, how the resources and the experience, you can kind of curate them to your best, advantage.
I love that. That makes a lot of sense.
I could see that.
It seems to be, with all of the architects we've spoken with, everyone seems to think that some kind of gap between undergraduate school and grad school is very, very helpful and productive on the span of 1 to 5 years. Everyone tells me like 5 years is the max, and I could understand that. Like if you were working for 5 years or doing something else, that's a long time to pass.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And it's also, I think, difficult. Undergrad school can be so, really challenging, and you're so kind of in this tunnel zone, this mindset that you need to step outside of it to, like you said, get some better perspective and understand what it is you really want to do in grad school.
Yeah, again, as an undergrad, typically you have this core curriculum. You're not given a lot of options. You may or may not have a research project or an independent study at the end, but that mindset is very different than grad school, where, in the best case, you can fully take advantage of, not just the people who are at the school you're at, but even outside resources at the larger university. So I think having that time gives you some perspective and is very valuable. Yeah.
Were there any particular places or things that you saw whilst traveling that, were particularly informative for your grad school studies, or you yourself in general?
Yeah. I mean, the SOM fellowship my research topic or my investigation was a topic that's kind of a wordy title, but I can explain it more simple. But it's basically called The Single Building as Urban Intervention. And the idea was that, as architects, typically we're designing one structure, within a context, in this case, the city, and we're not able to necessarily transform everything around it or rethink the entire, physical or social structure. So I was studying institutional buildings primarily that were from different parts of history and how the architects engaged the physical and social surroundings through them. So examples of buildings were the Stockholm City Library by Asplund, which was the first public library in Sweden and is in an interesting site in the city, and formally is really an interesting paradigm, that interestingly Asplund came to the United States to research libraries because America had more of a history of public libraries and Carnegie libraries and things. Or another example was another library actually was the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève by Le Brouste in Paris, which was the first steel, one of the early cast iron buildings, sorry, not steel, but also was a new typology. So I had taken a course undergrad in the history of building types, which was looking at how, civic, in many cases, institutional buildings like museums, libraries, schools were generated primarily out of kind of Enlightenment times and sort of some cases maybe Renaissance. But so that this study topic was an outgrowth of that.
That's really fascinating.
So did you get to see these buildings in person?
Yes, I spent 9 months traveling by myself all around Europe. I would spend a month in each city. So when I was in Stockholm, I spent a month there. I looked, obviously, every day I would go over to the library and sketch. But I also looked at other buildings by Asplund in Stockholm and Leverins and, the cohort of architects from that time period. Of course, modern architecture is, contemporary architecture as well. Yeah. So it was and what I took from it beyond the topic itself was really seeing in a way that I'd never experienced directly because I grew up in a suburb. Yeah. And although I visited the city, I saw how people interacted with buildings and how these older structures, continued to be in different ways parts of the physical and social context that they were located. So that was really eye-opening. And also how they changed like with times of day, with light. So a lot of my sketching was using, trying to capture qualities of light and shadow and things like that. So I became aware in a way, I guess you'd say, of kind of the power that buildings have or that architecture has, even in simple ways to engage people, and the environment.
It's a funny thing because, as architects, our job is more or less to design and help create buildings, which do all the things you described, and we're on the creation side of it. But a big part, I think, of being a good architect, or the fun of it, is also just observing first and understanding how things work and falling in love with how things work and falling with love with buildings and light and all the things you mentioned. But in the day in the life of an architect or the day in the life of a student, sometimes you don't really get a whole lot of time to do what you just described, and you have to almost force yourself or carve out time to do that, to kind of re-nourish oneself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What I like about living in New York City is, and my wife and I really enjoy walking around, and so you're not even sometimes having an agenda, but you're seeing people do things and just, taking it all in. So I've always loved that. And the way the character of different neighborhoods in the city, and when you walk through them, and one neighborhood blending to another, and just the character of the architecture or the quality of the street life, things like that. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite neighborhood in New York?
That's a good question. I mean, I've always lived on the west side of Manhattan in downtown. So we lived in the West Village for a couple of years, and then we've lived in Chelsea on the far west side of Manhattan for 30 years. So, we live in a huge old building called London Terrace, which is amazing. It's from 1930. It's an entire city block. It was one of the largest apartment buildings in the world when it was built. But we face what is now the High Line, which is kind of cool. We're not directly next to it, but it's across the street and on the other side of 10th Avenue. And so like the transformation that's happened in our neighborhood is just phenomenal, since we've lived there. And so seeing that also is another, just in terms of temporality and a kind of understanding of cities as these places that change over time. I mean, you literally see it, it's unfolded. And of course, New York City in general has transformed it. The relationship of the city to the water is completely different than it was 30 years ago in many respects. And just, obviously general construction as well. Yeah.
I was going to say, if you lived in Chelsea for 30 years, you probably saw it change quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, mostly west of 10th Avenue, because east of 10th Avenue is part of it's a historic district, and there's just more existing construction. But when they rezoned the area, well, first it was art galleries, commercial art galleries coming into what had been taxi garages and just older warehouses and commercial buildings. And then the next wave of development was related to the air rights from the High Line, which created a whole series of, adjacent apartment buildings.
You were talking about the focus of your research being, at the title being something to the effect of a single building as an installation or impact on a city.
Urban intervention.
Urban intervention, perfect.
Yep.
And then your description of New York City made me want to ask, had you ever considered studying urban design as a different, somewhat different, topic, or was it always strictly architecture?
It was always architecture. It's interesting. At the time I was studying architecture, my perception of urban design was that it was much more analytical and data oriented, as opposed to qualitative. And I could be wrong. That's why I'm saying my perception of it. UVA had an urban design program. I didn't really, I might have tangentially seen, things on the walls of the teaching spaces, which we might have shared with that department, but it wasn't something that had the, what I see now with urban design in many respects is it seems much more vibrant and interesting to me than it did at the time. Again, purely my perception. So it's not denigrating anyone's, they could have been doing all that at the time, and I just didn't have any idea.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's a kind of fair, observation or perception, because that's generally, from what I've seen, city planning is what you're describing in terms of its, education of that. But city planning and urban design are weird names next to each other. A lot of people don't know the difference, and urban design as a profession, it's hardly even a profession, but as a profession is a very, very new thing. And yeah, it is. I remember, so my master's is in urban design, and I remember I was on a review, and the question was posed like, well, what is urban design, relative to the professions of architecture and city planning, which everyone knows. And my thought was, well, it's got to be what you just said, which is if city planning tends to be the more analytical, nuts and bolts engineering aspects of cities, but who's designing, the city? And other than the specific buildings, like someone has to be thinking about the qualitative aspects, which,
Yeah, and it's funny, we've done, our work on the urban climate change adaptation in New York City, which related to a La Trobe grant that our firm got with another, as a collaborator with other team members, but also then this exhibition at MoMA called Rising Currents. That was very much about looking at the infrastructure of Manhattan and reconceiving how stormwater management and resiliency with respect to storm surge could happen. But it was looking at both the kind of performative aspect of the city, how it literally absorbs or deals with temporary influx of water, and then also the qualitative aspect about the city as a kind of public space, the streets essentially. But yeah, so it's something that we've been. And I probably entered into that in a way more from, or thinking about that type of design from some of our collaborations with landscape architects, where the temporal quality of how a landscape changes over time, there are aspects of that are similar to, a city as well. So, yeah,
that's a great observation. So after you finished grad school, you practice at a couple of offices, some of them which are very well known. At what point did you know or decide to start your own office? How did that happen?
Yeah, I was teaching at University of Michigan, so I worked for Deborah Burke, and then I worked for Stephen Hall. I worked for Deborah Burke for a year, a little over a year, and then Stephen Hall for about 4 years. And then I got a teaching fellowship at University of Michigan. And while I was at Michigan, they still have several different types of teaching fellows. Mine was for someone in my position who had been out in practice for, 4 to 6 years and was coming back in a way to teach. And so that was where I began to formulate, with one of my partners now, who I actually met at Princeton, Stephen Cassell, establishing the firm. And again, at the time, it's like a leap of faith. I don't think we had any grand vision for like an office. I don't even know honestly, I don't even remember what we were thinking, but it's sort of just the desire to do work and to feel like we knew what we were doing. We had been well trained at the previous places we were working. And so we felt qualified in a way to do this. And as a means of expression and sort of developing our thoughts, so.
Do you remember what your guys' first project was?
Our first project, well, there were a handful that were going on all at once. One of the early, but they were all very small. One of them was the renovation of a warehouse building in Soho in Manhattan, which was a little bit larger, but it was mostly technical. But then it had an apartment within it that we worked on. But the projects in that building went on for 5 or 6 years. At the same time, we did a couple of very small kitchen scale, renovations. And then we did a renovation of a attic space for friends of mine in a house that they had in upstate New York. So those were kind of some of one of the early ones related to that building in Soho was we did a steel plate fence. It's on the corner of Thompson and Broome Streets in Soho that enclosed what at the time was an outdoor sculpture space for the tenant of the ground floor that was a sculpture, like a sculpture gallery. So we did this fence that enclosed the corner. The fence is still there actually, but it was a steel plate. So very simple construction. Yeah.
It sounds like most of your experience at Hall's office and Burke, I mean, those offices generally do much larger scale projects. And I'm assuming that's the type of work you were doing whilst at those places?
No, at the time, Deborah's office was only 3 people. So, yeah. So I worked on a house in Indianapolis for a year. I worked on the design development and construction drawings of a house. And then at Stephen Hall's office, I worked on a house in Cleveland that had been designed, and we did the construction drawings, but it did not end up getting built. And then I worked on the first version of the School of Architecture at University of Minnesota, which got a PA award in like 1989 or 90. And then it went on hiatus, and it didn't actually get built until like the late 90s, and it was a pretty different design, different diagram. And then I worked on, but my main project at Stephen Hall's office was a project called the Stretto House. It was a house in Dallas that was built, and I worked on that for 3 years. Really interesting building that engaged an existing stream, and the water from the stream came into part of the building, and there's a guest house on the other side of the stream, and we did a little bridge connecting the two. So that was kind of my main project. And at the time I was at Stephen Hall's office, there were only about between 8 and 12 people at any given time in the office.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a silly question, but at that time, Instagram and maybe even websites were not quite a thing, right? So
No.
how was a starting office like your guys' office was going about marketing themselves and finding clients? Because
in person,
the outreach was much more limited.
Yeah, that's a good question. It was kind of relationship based. So we got things in motion. The first projects we did were through personal connections. And then as we began to get more work and we got some things published, the landscape of publishing was not as fragmented and as extensive as it is today. Yeah. So, if you got something published in, architecture or Progressive Architecture magazine, but what it was called back then, or Architectural Record, that was a big thing. Like everyone looked at those, and so we were sought out by some clients. We also did some work that was more in the public realm. We did early projects that were temporary exhibition design in different museums. So we did 4 exhibits at the Cooper Hewitt Museum that were an opportunity for a younger firm to actually do something that was in the public realm, because most of our work up to that point was purely for private clients and not necessarily accessible to the public. So those were really important opportunities because, number one, from a standpoint of idea, the projects had a curatorial intent. And so there was a kind of thought behind how to, information and how to present it. And then there was an engagement with the existing fabric. In this case, it was the Carnegie Mansion for the Cooper Hewitt, and how to do that. One of our first exhibition design there was for the industrial designer, Henry Dreyfuss. And we got that through a friend of mine wrote his PhD about Dreyfuss and was the curator of the exhibition. And so Dreyfuss is the guy who invented the Honeywell round thermostat, really famous, one. The John Deere tractors, the Model 500 telephone that everyone had, like 95 million of them in America, the black, with the telephone. So these objects were all on display. It was fascinating. That was one of and then we did a couple of other exhibits for the Asia Society here in New York. And we did one for the AIA that was in the Customs House, which is a beautiful Beaux-Arts building in the southern tip of Manhattan that has a kind of oval atrium, and that's where this was installed. So that was a good, experience to get out there more and get more known.
Yeah.
Was the intention when you started the office to kind of like be able to do projects of different typologies, or it just kind of happened out of maybe your own interest without necessarily like aiming for that?
No, we always wanted to have a range of work that we did. It's true that in the early years, most of it was residential. Yeah. So we were doing apartments or single family detached houses houses, but we had, because of the exhibition design, and then we got some commercial work, and that's good in the sense that it's hard when you start your office to actually get work for like a university or those clients are very risk averse and they don't necessarily hire firms that haven't done that before or done certain scales of work before. Yeah. But we definitely were mindful of wanting a diverse range of work, and that what would unite that work was kind of our approach to how we thought about design, that we had a methodology of inquiry. We would ask questions. We were looking at constraints intrinsically when you do work in New York City and inside existing buildings for residential. You can't change so many things, but you end up engaging, whether it's existing views and windows or infrastructure or structure, that those become, in effect, not things you have to compromise about, but you have to fold into your understanding of, the design and leverage them as opportunities, if you will.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. It's interesting also because from an outsider's perspective, meaning someone who's not an architect, the normal kind of way to critique or understand the expertise of someone in an industry that you don't know is whether or not they specialize in one aspect of it. Like the more specialized you are, the more you're perceived as an expert, generally speaking, by people who aren't in the profession. But what you've described is, of course, kind of the opposite in terms of project typology. But you mentioned having a particular methodology to the, analyzing the problem and then proposing solutions. What is it about that approach what is that approach, and has it evolved, over the years?
Yeah, I think it at its core, what we think of as research has a few different implications or connotations. So on the one hand, it's just a philosophy that we think about design as a mode of inquiry into the physical and social context that buildings and spaces are located into society at large, or cities, or rural sites. And then that's manifest in terms of how we gather information about a site or engage people, through, interviews, meetings, workshops, to understand how people use space, and how to inform basically, relationships between space and types of spaces that are in a project. We're oftentimes involved very early with clients to define the program of a project. So we're framing, in effect, what is the project, in some cases, early on together with the client. So but then the research also has a side related to projects that we do that are either funded or independently, such as the La Trobe grant that funded research into urban climate change adaptation, or that are a project related to, let's say, a product design. Like what's behind me is one of the products in the line of acoustical products that we designed for Filzfelt, which is a division of Knoll. So there was a whole process of creating a kind of series of different applications for felt-faced acoustical absorptive panels in different forms, whether they're on the walls or ceilings or tabletop. I could back up for a second to say that, we think about architecture, I like to say, expansively. So it's in terms of this diverse work, but holistically within each project in terms of scale, and then relationally in terms of, that everything we make has some relationship to something else. It's not thought of as an object in and of itself, even though it's maybe perceived that way. Mm-hmm. So that kind of expansive aspect of architecture, how we think about it, is reflected in some of those research projects, whether it's the scale of a detail or an element, all the way to thinking about, a larger scale urban project. And then we try to identify things within each project that are opportunities for investigation. So we're doing a new administration and education building at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, and we're doing a terracotta cladding and on the building, and that was an opportunity to create a kind of bespoke terracotta shade and building cladding on that project. So in that sense, that was like a specific thing that we wanted to explore that would give a character and a quality to the project. So at its core, and this is what's challenging sometimes with specialization or with what we try to communicate in terms of like why hire us, it's that we're going to create a design that is very specific to the client through a process of engaging them really as a thought partner, and creating something that's very bespoke that doesn't means it has to be expensive or complicated, but that embodies their mission, their values, and is a kind of way of translating them into form, actualizing them, enabling them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great, all of what you said is great. That's a great description too of, I think, what architecture aspires to be, or what it does really, is a translation of just ideas and, murky, vague conceptual things that sometimes for clients have never even spoken aloud in a coherent way ever. They've just been ideas for the last, decade sometimes. And then we have to pull that out of them, through words and conversation most of the time, then put it on paper as words and then as drawings. And when you think about it in that way, the evolution of a project starting from its initial birth, which are these conversations around vague ideas, to then being a building where you're detailing, oh, this window detail doesn't fit the idea of the building. Like that's a wild. I'm actually kind of surprised myself. It's kind of like it's a wild thing, right? To go from all the way from that to the big full building, and then you're looking at details on how two pieces of material meet or don't meet. It's a weird thing.
Funny. No, it's so funny you say that, because I was actually we had lunch with friends of ours last weekend, and one of them said, and they both have like PhDs and they're really smart people, and one of them said, it seems just overwhelming to think about creating a building, like where do you start? And I was sort of like, well, it starts off really big scale and kind of fuzzy, and then gets incrementally more detailed. Like it's not overwhelming if you think about it. Like you don't have to worry about the detail at the beginning, But he was like, I had never thought of it that way, but it echoes what you just said. It's like, yeah. I guess if you'd really freak out if you thought about it at the beginning, everything you have to do, all the way.
If you started designing from the detail, I mean, that could be
sometimes it's a point of inspiration, but...
Yes. It's funny. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, one of the things I did during the pandemic, my personal pandemic project, was designing a 3-legged stool that in effect was starting from the small and working outward. And so it was kind of cathartic in the sense of, having been on Zoom every day for like 8 hours and just wanting to just go down to my workshop and make things and then understand, okay, this is something that's intrinsically an object. It's a thing you can pick up, but how does it gain meaning and not simply aesthetically or visually consumed? It has a function. It can be aggregated into groups. It has a materiality, there are details and whatnot. So that was very, thinking from the detail scale sometimes does happen for sure.
Yeah. And that's the inverse is a strange thing. Sometimes a detail can really embody, it feels like half or 60%, 70%, 80% of the core of a project is just within a detail sometimes.
I agree.
You used I think your description of the practice as well was interesting. I think you said it was something like expansive, relational, and then holistic. And I've not heard. I don't think I've ever heard of a practice or the way you guys operate as being described that way. But it makes sense that it also points to the multi-dimensional aspect to architecture and architecture practice is those three, which are very different things, but they intersect. I don't have a question with that, but it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, it is. But I was also wondering, like, who is part of the team in your office? Because if you get down to like the detail of designing the cladding of one of the building and that kind of level of design, like, do you have product designers or people in the team that just focuses on that aspect of the project, and some that maybe focus more on like
management,
or
concept design?
Yeah.
So we have 37 people in the office. We have 3 partners. We have a studio director who has been in the firm for over 20 years. And then we have what we call project directors who might be thought of as associates. So they all of them have been in the office for probably 7 to 15 to 20 years. And so they're then leading teams, and then we have project managers. So we have a small team structure that works on every project. The size varies depending upon the project. We have a technical director, someone who's reviewing things, and involved in the technical development of the project. But when we're doing projects since most of our projects are very unique, we will oftentimes have specialist consultants who we work with who are envelope consultants or cladding consultants. So like on the Greenwood project I mentioned, Heinches, which is a envelope and cladding consultant, is worked with us to develop and is really the exterior envelope and detailing of that. But so our collaborators who are specialists, generally speaking, really like to work with us because we don't come in and say, we have a formal idea and you need to make it look like this.
Yeah, make it work.
Right. It's more like, you guys know what you have an expertise, and how can we engage that in the service of, the ideas that we're exploring in the project. And so there's a process of, you probably call it like co-creation, but it's a close collaboration that, and that is, so we're deeply involved. We don't just sort of say, oh, the facade person's going to create the facade of the building or things like that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of back and forth. But so I would say we don't have specific specialists within the office for different types of construction, but we have people who now at this point have experience. We have one person who's a certified passive house designer, because one of our recently completed projects is in the process of being certified for passive house. So there is definitely different knowledge and experience in the office that we bring to bear on projects.
The consultant aspect is very interesting, and I feel like facade consultants are probably some of the more unknown type of consultants. Is it hard to explain to a client that you need to have the expertise of these people to join a project? Like, do they see that as someone that's kind of like superfluous to have, or are they understanding why you need to have that consultant on?
That's a good question. We haven't ever experienced a client sort of questioning that. So when we worked on the School of Architecture edition at Princeton University, we worked with a firm called Front, which is a facade consultant. And if I recall correctly, no one ever said, when we were doing a bespoke, essentially, curtain wall on the building, I think maybe it was because the facilities managing people realize that you need that type of person on the team to do that. Or in the case of the school, we just finished these two large public schools in downtown Brooklyn that are the ones that are going to be in the process of doing passive house certification. Front was also involved in the windows on that. And that was where you have to get a certain performance out of the project. So you need that expertise. So it hasn't actually come up. Interestingly, though, as an aside, we always work with lighting designers.
I was just going to say,
and so what's funny is, and we have for decades, like we literally don't do a project without a lighting designer. But we've encountered when we've collaborated with other firms in other parts of the country where they're like, oh, why would we need a lighting designer on it? And I'm like, you gotta be kidding. Like, who's gonna pick the lighting? Who's gonna figure out the lighting for the project? It's gotten so specialized, especially. So like, I'm surprised that an architect would do a project without a lighting consultant, for instance.
I was just going to remark on this part of the conversation. I think when a trade or profession or aspect of the project is technical, it's far less likely to be questioned by the client. And this even applies to like an architect themselves who does everything from design to construction documents. No client is questioning, the quality of your construction documents because they can't read them, right? And I think a facade consultant falls into the category of that. Like, well, we need the building to perform. Lighting design, though, why can't you just, put some lights in the RCP, put a few of those circles in the RCP and use the ones you used before, and I can tell you where I want, in the case of a house like we do, I can tell you where the switches should go. But there's like way more to it, even at the scale of and certainly the scale of a larger project but I think it's anything that's, unfortunately, that's qualitative. It's more difficult for people to understand the value, and those get questioned quickly.
No, absolutely. And so on the Rothko Chapel project that we did, renovation of the existing building piece we worked with a lighting designer named George Sexton, who specializes in daylight. And so the whole, really one of the most important things in that space was to improve the quality of daylight. So that was a very close collaboration. But we also then, and partly speaks to what you asked earlier, Marina, about technical knowledge, we did what we call the design assist, where we brought on board a fabricator early in the process. I think it was before construction documents, at the end of DD or during DD, to actually help develop the skylight assembly and the louvers that filter the light. And so they were directly involved, and we could benefit from their knowledge of the material and fabrication, and not kind of reinvent the wheel, but have and it also gave some assurance of the cost, as you were going forward. So that is a model that we've done on other projects as well. Yeah,
that's another really good point. And we're generally, huge advocates of what you just described, because if you can have more of the team onboarded earlier, it just helps. And it's not like In that case, it sounds like it was a pretty close collaboration with the fabricator. And sometimes it is that, and other times it's just I need the ability to pick up the phone and call that consultant once a month, and it's a 2-hour conversation, and that's all I need. But it makes a huge impact, and it also make us feeling confident that you're able to take concrete steps forward. Because, like as you know, one of the challenging things in architecture is that there's always a bunch of aspects to the design of a structure that's placeholder that is like 50% developable. I know it's solvable, so we'll get to it kind of later. But when you have something where it could work and could not work and you don't know because it's outside of your expertise, then that's where the process becomes really difficult to move forward because you're kind of stuck or always questioning. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And depending upon the client, there's also a desire to have some assurance about the cost of the project, oftentimes at a very early stage. So some of the cost estimators we work with are really good at kind of the art of early stage conceptual estimating to take into account some of the things that are unknowns.
Yeah.
But yes, depending upon the client, the desire to even as we were saying earlier, at the kind of fuzzy early stage of the project, have some sense of where you're going, is a driver toward somehow having some technical knowledge get embedded early on.
And then going back again to the people working in the office, it sounds like you have a few key folks who, like a technical director was I think one of the titles, but it sounds like generally that the architects in the office are not categorized so specifically to be in different buckets of solely being project manager versus concept design versus something else, or is that the case, or are people in kind of groups by project typology, or how does it work? Is everyone mixed up?
Yeah, no, we have, similar to our practice having a diverse range of work, the people who work in the office have opportunities to work in different types of buildings or programs. So it's, and generally speaking, what you're doing is commensurate with your level of experience, but we also mentor and have opportunities for people to, learn how to be a project manager. If they've never done it, then they get the right support from the project director and the team, so that, or they start on a smaller project and then the next project they do might be a larger one. So we're very careful about how we put teams together and the skill sets that people have, but also wanting people to be constructively challenged, to be engaged in the work. So that's a really important part, and always has been. I think when we ask, and we do this periodically, people, to assess how they feel about being in the office, we almost always get high marks for the quality of mentorship and learning that happens here. So, but also support. So it's like, you don't just get thrown into something and then, how do I figure this out?
How many times have I seen that or experienced that?
Yeah.
You want me to design what?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. And then just go away and you're like, what am I supposed to do with this? So I think that's important. Interestingly, so part of us working on our book was assessing kind of the impact that we feel the office has had on the profession. And this is back a couple of years ago, but I think it's still pretty accurate. Something like 35 firms that exist now are alumni of our firm.
Wow.
And globally. And of them, about 17, I think, are women-led firms, which, I'm really proud of both things, because I think it speaks to people who came through the office, spent varying lengths of time, most of them several years or longer, and then felt well prepared to do whatever they were going to do professionally, and then in effect having impact through their practice on the field of architecture and on people. So I'm very proud of that, but I think it speaks to how we think about creating architecture in the setting of an office. Yeah.
You guys are really firing on all cylinders. You think about the architecture, the practice, the everything else. And talking about the book, the monograph, I think this was the first one for ARO. What does it mean for you guys as an office to produce and publish and this book, which is out and came out I think the end of last year, so everyone should check it out. We'll have links in the episode and whatever. But what does it mean for you guys to produce this monograph?
Well, it's our second monograph. Our first one was actually a little over 20 years ago, but much smaller, and was really featuring I think 5 or 6 projects, and kind of trying to frame our practice at that time. So this one, I happen to have a copy of it here. You can see
a little thicker than 5.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this was quite an effort, and a lot of people were involved in it. Angela Estevez, who's the business strategy and communications director in our office, really shepherded this through. But we also worked with amazing people, Brooke Hodge, who wrote the introductory essay, Miko McGinty, who's the book designer, and others were involved in editing and developing the project, both external and internal. So it was a multi-year effort. It was an opportunity to take stock on the one hand of 30 plus years of work, but also try to frame it in a way that reflected at its core our values. So some of it is what we talked about earlier in terms of how we approach architecture, our process, and kind of demonstration of what I said before about the kind of expansive, holistic, and relational. But I think ultimately it's organized. The book is organized as a series of principles that projects are grouped under, which the principles are really a constellation of kind of the framework that we think about design. And so it was very helpful to do that, to also both distill and clarify kind of the culture of the firm as well through the book. So it was super important to us and a huge effort.
I was going to say, how long did that book take to make?
I mean, we started working on it 3 years before it came out,
wow.
But we really started thinking about the book probably, 8 or 10 years before.
Wow.
And then the real intense period of work was probably the year before the book came out. Yeah. So that was when, just because it has, it's 400 pages long, it's got hundreds and hundreds of images, and and there's the writing. There's a conversation with Stephen Cassell, Kim Yao, and myself at the end. So it's, but our intent was always that it's both something that a non-architect can look at and understand and see what our values are and how they're manifest in the work we've done and the impact that work has, as well as a student could look at it and think about, here's a framework for how to think about design, or our peers could think about it as well. So we had really always 3 kind of audiences in mind, and I guess also the 4th might be like our family.
Yes, your list. I forget that.
You don't have to worry. Like your mom is gonna definitely enjoy the book. That's a safe audience. So, yeah.
It's a beautiful book. It strikes me as it must have been difficult, and one of the questions I had, which you kind of answered, was how much of in the process of creating it, how much of you, how do I phrase it? How much of your understanding of the office and the framing of the office did you have before creating the book that clearly guided the book and was kind of known, versus how much of that came about as a result of producing the book and then learning about I guess yourselves because of that process?
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I think we clearly understood, what was funny is after having a series of possible titles, we ended up with the architecture period, research period office.
I like it. It's great.
Yeah. So, but what we came back to and why we did that was ultimately the name of the firm in a way describes, who we are in terms of our goal, our process, and our ethos, our culture. And so that's fundamental. I don't think I think what we learned from working on this was by articulating these principles, and I can tell you what a couple of them are. Like they in some respects are truisms about design, but I also think making these principles, explaining how they are specific to us, it was in effect one of the important, maybe the most fundamental work that we did, which was generated not just with Stephen, Kim, and I, but with the cohort of people who were working together on the book. So it was a larger group, and I think so they're like, here, I'll open up the book and tell you some of them, but one of them is, strategize for maximum impact. So some of that, to me, what do we mean by that? Well, in on the scale of a project, what we were talking about earlier, like when we think there's an element of the project that can be extremely impactful, whether it's the facade or a particular quality of the structure or something, we are comfortable saying that's where the emphasis should be. In other words, it's not just the architectural form that carries the content or the idea, as an example. Or thinking about what I said earlier on the Rising Currents project, infrastructure as a element that you can design to make for impactful public space in the city. That's sort of thinking strategically. The social act of architecture is pretty obvious, but I think we do it through, a deep engagement of, as we were saying earlier, of mission and of how people use space and think about not only how they use it now, but how they could use it in the future or experience space. So each of these, the ones engage the complexity of context, elevate the ordinary, design for use and experience, work with integrity. Use and experience are important to us. And again, I've always taken for granted that if you have an idea in architecture, it should be something that someone can understand directly through the building. It's Rafael Mineo has this amazing text called The Solitude of Buildings. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's from the mid 80s, but it's basically about when you create a building when it's done, it's out there external to the architect. And, you're not there explaining it to anyone. It takes on a life of its own, right? Yeah. And so that design for use and experience is about how the qualities of light or its particular orientation of a site, et cetera, allow you just to, without interpretation, in effect, understand, the intent of the project and have it be meaningful,
I love that. You guys have, and by the way, the name of the office I think is fantastic, but it's also one of the names that kind of annoys me because I'm like, I wish that I could name my office that, because it's like it outlines exactly what you do and exactly and all three are necessary and related. They're not completely separate. Architecture, research, and office. You need all three to be working to enforce each other. I think it's fantastic. You guys clearly spent a lot of time thinking about the office portion of those three words. Are there things in the profession of architecture, just kind of zooming out, now that you see as being maybe problematic? So, like, what are the biggest challenges the profession is facing and areas that the profession and offices in general can improve on?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think, only a tiny fraction of what is built is actually designed by architects. I think one fundamental issue that architecture has is helping people understand what value architects have, and commensurate with that, it's also the kind of compensation that architects should have for the work they do. And I think as we're thinking about making the field, something that's attractive to people to enter into, in a way, communicating our value to the public, I think, is important, and it's a never-ending process. But I think that's important. I mean, there's other challenges that architecture is not as a profession, but that we're addressing, which is not really related to your question. That are things like climate change and other things like that. So that's different. But I think just vis-a-vis the profession itself, I think it's a real challenge of like what makes architecture relevant and to me and impactful, like beyond, it's not simply an aesthetic exercise. It's not a form of criticism in and of itself. It's about offering alternative potential realities and transforming the status quo in a positive way. And so, I think architects, and I've been on many, many AIA juries and design juries and whatnot, and I think a lot of times architects, by virtue of their training, sometimes conflate kind of composition with design, or form with idea. And so, or we have our own kind of fetishization of, things that we're interested in. So I think it's kind of being mindful of that, one can certainly appreciate and lavish attention on making form, because that's what we do. But then how is it in the service of something more? How is it? And that's where the relational side to me matters, and the reciprocity that a building has with its place and time and with people. So it's funny that it's just, I think people's perception of architecture is based upon media and just sort of other things. But so to the extent we can be ambassadors for, a visionary way of engaging the world, but also one that's practical and problem solving, like that we actually have a value, is really important, So those are things that we try to do that hopefully can address, what I see as a problem, with architecture's, capacity or being thought about as something that can help, be part of the solving problems in the world today, basically.
That's awesome. That's a perfect description, and I love it. Your commentary about sometimes architects being obsessed or fetishizing, certain things that are form based, black curves or whatever it must be, NURBS and splines and whatever else it might be, and kind of divorcing that from in my mind, I was thinking like the research aspect or the practical aspects or the community engagement aspect or whatever else on that side of the line. That divorcing is common. And I think one of the misconceptions that, or mistakes that I think some architects make, and certainly young architects, I'm thinking even about students in school studying architecture, is they think that the research aspect of architecture, the learning aspect of learning about the client, the site, engaging again with communities, that stuff is boring. And it's like a thing you have to do. It doesn't actually, it doesn't, how do I say it? Like you have to put it in the building, yes, but really it's like kind of like with the technical person you said earlier, the facade person, I have the form and I need to just cram in the program so it works, and then that's what I'm going to do. But I don't think that, I actually think that the research aspects can be the most interesting if you do it right.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And we're teaching this semester at MIT. So this is the last of 3 springs that Stephen Kim and I have been teaching at MIT. And the program that we've given, this is the 3rd time, is a dual language pre-K through 2nd grade school, public school in Boston. And we're using it. And again, our goal is not to make the studio a kind of form of practice, but rather to inculcate this aspect of engagement that you're just talking about in very specific ways through how you approach the problem. So they're going to be meeting with and talking to teachers who teach dual language early childhood education. We are using daylight as a prompt in the space, and they're using Climate Studio software and physical models to look at daylight in relation to the quality of the classroom space. And then there's a community component, because many of these schools serve immigrant populations and have functions that happen after school as well in terms of meeting space and whatnot. So that kind of the scalar component, from the scale of the child and the classroom to the civic quality of the building, and then the relationship that it has to the city, is all important. So we're in a very small way, we're having these components as part of the design process. And at the end of the semester, the students will have a building that they've designed, and they're going to work independently. That is a modest size, 30,000 square foot building, but that will be an opportunity to kind of do this, to emulate a methodology that we think is important. And then, again, and I think it's important when you're a student to be exposed to a number of different methodologies
Sure.
as you begin to think about your own way of working subsequently. So, yeah, so it's within that framework that's what we have to offer, in the context of as practitioners, teaching.
I love that. And it even makes sense for your own practice because, I've always thought about every office as kind of by necessity for their longevity to be a kind of school environment. Not that there's students and teachers, but that there needs to be kind of an education. So everyone is understanding at least the core philosophy or core, strategizing and thinking approach that's occurring in the office. I think elsewise it just becomes kind of a circus.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Now, we've always, taught different places and lectured to academic and other audiences and things. So yes, having to explain what you do and reflect upon it is really important.
Yeah, it's hard
obviously
though.
You do that to clients, but
But
then outside of that, pulling back, is yes, and it takes time, and it can be quite involved.
It's like the most difficult part of the job sometimes. It's easier just to do it rather than trying to, that's why I'm impressed by, the monograph. One of the final questions for me is there a type of project that you haven't done yet that you want to, or one that you'd like to do more of?
That's a great question. I think, this is probably personal, but we've done projects involving visual arts, whether it's renovation of Donald Judd's studio and house, or work for Dia Art Foundation. We're doing a commercial art gallery now for Blum, which is a Los Angeles-based gallery here in New York. We're doing their gallery here. It's under construction. But so I think for me, I really enjoy, and Rothko Chapel mentioning earlier, I love the interaction with art and visual art as a part of the project. And we did work, couple of projects in the book are projects we did for Calvin Klein when Raph Simmons was the creative director, and we collaborated with him and with the artist Sterling Ruby, whose studio is in Los Angeles. And so those kind of collaborations, and I find really satisfying to do. So, but we've never done a museum, kind of plain, stated, of that building type. We've done ones that are very similar. So that would be something that's interesting to me personally. But I really enjoy the range. Like, I love working on commercial office space. I enjoy the projects we've done in cultural and arts organizations. Our work at universities is interesting and very impactful within campus settings. And so I probably don't have one type that, and at this point we've done a fair number of project types, but I would say, probably something along a cultural or arts related building, would be interesting to me. And again, not because we haven't done it, but maybe just to do more of that.
Final question. That is sometimes hard to answer, but do you have a favorite building?
No. You can't.
Yeah.
No. But the question can't be, do you have? Because we've asked that before, and someone said no, and they skirted the question.
Okay,
the question,
which one is your favorite?
Yeah, what is your favorite building?
And it doesn't have to be one of yours. it could be, but it could also be someone else.
Wow. Well, I can approach that. I don't know if this response will be acceptable to you, but I would say one of my favorite architects is Adolf Loos, somebody I studied. And in terms of his reticence to create form qua form, but at the same time creating actually a transformational formal typology, the round plan, for houses, and his innate ability to see through the kind of bullshit of our profession as well in his writings. And to realize that at its essence, we have this relationship with a kind of a particular project, client, people. So that's that. I think, my wife and I were recently in Finland. I had been there a few times earlier, but we were looking at Aalto's work. To me, it's still incredible. I guess my favorite, if I were to pull it back and say, in America, who's my favorite architect, probably Lou Kahn. I think buildings that stand the test of time, that keep giving back, that have a kind of generosity of space and experience and materiality. Probably my favorite of those is the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth. But then even the Exeter Library project he did, if you thought about that as you're an architect and an independent school in, in New England comes to you and says, we need a new library. I mean, he created a building that is like this, statement, but at the same time, completely integrated into its setting. So it's that capacity to do something that's kind of mind-blowingly timeless, solved all of the problems and met the programmatic needs that they had, but and continues to serve them decades later. That's my paradigm of what I consider, amazing architecture. So, and it's very hard to do projects like that in this day and age. There's a number of things that make that difficult, but that's sort of my, what I aspire to.
I love that. Well, I do have one last follow-up question. So what are some of the things now that make it difficult to achieve that?
I think it's what would I say? There's a lot more complexity in how buildings are put together today, I think, than there were then. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a directness to his projects that takes real consideration to achieve. I think firms like Herzog and de Meuron does a really good job with that, I think. And there are others, Chipperfield and handful of others. But I think it's finding the right client who's willing to invest the time. Like for Khan, the projects were always a real journey, that took place over years, and had the possibility of failure, which I think, in hindsight, we might not think it, but at the time, Khan had a number of projects that just didn't come to fruition. So I think those are some of the things that make it difficult. And just our time frame of how we think about buildings is very different in terms of, and there's a lot more management of the process, I think, at times, which can be good, but also sometimes can be a hindrance to just allowing for the kinds of interactions between the architect and the team and the client and others to be generative of a solution that's going to be as durable, as some of his. But so, I think I'm sure if Khan were alive, he would say, well, all those problems existed then as well, which is probably true. So maybe it's just my excuse for why it's so hard to do it. I don't know.
Well, I think I have the same feelings. I think everything, even the world, everything's like much more complicated. Codes, building systems. It just, there's more. And sometimes there's a weight that comes with that if you don't have the right people involved.
No, and that's why, back to sort of our formulation of how we work on projects, that's why ultimately, and this is what I would tell students, generally speaking, although the field of architecture today is much more broad than when I was a student, and you can specialize in sustainable design, you can be an architect working as a project manager, you can work for a contractor, but that, however you do it, the sense that you're a generalist is important on some level, because with that specialization that you just said, there's this siloing that happens, and we shouldn't just be delegating things to others. We need to be figuring out how to synthesize that information into something, all of which is needed, into something that's impactful and meaningful, in its totality. So I think that's ultimately kind of the role of the architect, and that requires knowing what you don't know, knowing what kinds of questions to ask, having experiences. There's no substitute for that. Being highly collaborative. So those are kind of fundamental requirements to engage that type of work.
I love it. That's a great place to end. I was concerned my last question was going to bring it down, and you managed to save the conversation with some optimism.
Thanks.
I'm trying. Right.
Adam, this was so much fun. Thank you for spending the time on a Friday morning, and hopefully we can keep the conversation going.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail if you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion. Feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.